the point about the demand by Netanyahu that Abbas specifically and explicitly recognize Israel as a Jewish state. That is raising the bar. And you can understand why Abbas has backed away from accepting such a demand prior to any negotiations. I also wanted to go back briefly to the question of that the President himself raised in that clip that you showed about living up to the obligations of the roadmap agreed to in 2003. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu's position would be, and there's some support for it on the record, that the Palestinians were required to dismantle the terrorist network, and the Israelis were required to do a number of things to match that. Neither side has really lived up to those obligations. It's not just the Israelis who have not followed the roadmap. And one of the things you do not want to do, and I would say this strongly to President Obama, the point about fine print diplomacy, Bret's point, you do not want to get engaged with long and lengthy discussions with Benjamin Netanyahu in fine print diplomacy. He will tie you up in those details. You want to try to move quickly to principles. So I think any argument over who's lived up to what fulfilled obligations on the part of the roadmap is a dead end, and you need to cut right through that.
Go ahead, Bret.
Look, I think one of the productive ways of going forward, people talk about linkages, and should there or should there not be a linkage between Iran and what's happening with the Palestinians, between Israel and the Palestinians. From the Israeli point of view, there is a potential of a productive linkage, and I would say from the Palestinian point of view, a productive linkage between the two, because the question of Palestine does not really pose an existential threat to Israel. It is not that kind of strategic nuclear challenge. Iran is. And there is a way of bridging differences between the Netanyahu government and the Obama administration, which is to say, that is to say, as the Obama administration performs on Iran by sticking to deadlines in diplomacy, by inflicting or by having punitive sanctions in the event of the failure of the diplomacy, then we can start adjusting in terms of our relationships with the Palestinians. That seems to me a kind of win-win for three sides, for the Palestinians, Israelis, and for Washington.
Then 2 points. Number one, my impression is that the President is suggesting, that he's not looking for some date certain, but that they are going to come at this and look at it again and see if there's been progress made with Iran, and then they're prepared to move to tougher kinds of sanctions. That's implicit in what he is saying to Netanyahu.
Well, there's a famous story about Obama as president of the Harvard Law Review, that he would say something and everyone came away thinking that he agreed with him. And I was amused by the takeaway from the meeting between the two leaders, that you had some news stories saying, well, we're not going to have a fixed deadline, and other people saying, well, if by the end of the year nothing happens, then they're going to move to sanctions. I think this was Obama in his Harvard Law Review at his Harvard Law Review.
Okay, what did he say and what didn't he say?
Well, as I read the transcript, which I just did before I came here this evening, he said this is not a fixed date.
That's what I read too.
He simply said we'll reassess after 6 months.
But you look at every single media takeaway, and they all say by the end of the year we expect
they
progress.
Didn't read the transcript,
or else,
or they weren't there, or they heard what they wanted to hear.
You can have both of those. It seems to me you can have him saying not specifically by the end of the year, but at some reasonable time around the end of the year. We're going to take a look at this, and we're going to see if there's some progress. If not, then we'll reconsider and re-engage the idea of tougher sanctions.
Let's move to this issue of linkage.
I'd like to very much. That's crucial.
I think that one of the things that wasn't said was occupation. One of the things the President didn't mention, and of course the Prime Minister didn't mention, is occupation. They did talk about settlements, obviously. To think that you can keep this situation as it is, and that the Palestinians are just going to stay there passively and quiescently, is folly. This thing has to be moved very, very quickly. And I think the President perhaps may understand this, and perhaps is saying to Netanyahu, not just, we want to move on Iran, and we want you to move on settlements, or whatever it may be, but this is your last chance. Otherwise, you're going to create a one-state solution. It's not the Palestinians. They're too weak to create anything at this stage. You, the Israelis, by your own actions, will create the one-state nightmare in which you will either rule over this people unwillingly, or you'll be forced to accept them as citizens.
We've been talking about last chances, 2 minutes to midnight, for years, decades. This is an old story. The real clock that's ticking is the Iranian clock, and that is proceeding.
The demographic clock is ticking as well.
That clock is ticking and has been ticking for a very...
Non-Jews are a majority, according to Yadiot. non-Jews are a majority in the greater land of Israel as of this year.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the practical realities, the way
that's
that...
one clock.
Sure, there are plenty of clocks. The clock that people are looking at are the number of centrifuges that Iran is adding to its facilities there, how quickly they're moving towards a plutonium facility, the Russian fueling of the reactor. That's the clock that matters now.
Isn't it in Netanyahu's interest and his fear, concern about Iran getting the nuclear power in the next year or two?
I think Netanyahu's idea is to make progress on the ground, to make economic progress, to work with Salim Fayyad. At least that's what he told me when I did the first interview with him. And I think his vision is to make economic progress that people can see on the ground, so that people on the West Bank can actually see something happening. And I think that he feels that, he believes, this is what he says, that will be more, will actually make more progress and be more impressive to the Palestinian people. He may be wrong, he may be right, than just going on with more talks and talks and talks. And so I think that's his idea, is to create economic progress on the West Bank.
The president is more clear-headed on this than a lot of people, I think. He said you have to stop settlement. You have to make it very clear there's a political horizon. You have to show that this occupation is going to be rolled back, and you have to do it very quickly. People have been fooled and deceived since 1991, when negotiations began. Another year or two of negotiations is not going to solve this. I mean, for one thing, because the Iranian thing is, in fact, coming to a head. I was just pointing out to you that he wasn't talking about negotiations. He was actually talking about improving. The ticking clock is the Iranian rather than...
They're both ticking.
They're all ticking.
I should add, and I think you'll seize on this theme. I mean, there are a number of... First of all, there's a question of sequencing. The Iranian clock is ticking. The other clock that's ticking is toward a Palestinian election. And it is in Israel's supreme interest that Hamas not win that election. So, in that sense, progress on the peace front with the Palestinians is genuinely important to Netanyahu, because a Hamas victory is a disaster, ultimately will lead to the legitimization.
And, by the way, a disaster for Egypt, too.
Jim, talk to me about what the Arab countries, regardless of all the differences in terms of the nature of the governments, want in terms of the primacy of the Israeli-Palestinian settlement and a two-state solution.
Well, I think they want some kind of commitment from Netanyahu to pursue a two-state solution. Netanyahu's election is something of a setback for moderate Arab regimes, in that their public opinion, as Rashid Khalidi was saying earlier, is further inflamed, in fact, by Netanyahu's election, because he's seen as such a hardliner. I think there's an interesting question here whether or not you actually need somebody like Netanyahu in order to get a settlement at the end of the day. We can debate that perhaps another time. But I think they are saying to me that we need settlement freeze, and we need Netanyahu to accept the Arab peace initiative of 2002, and then perhaps we can take some of those steps. Now, this is a blow, I think, for Obama's strategy, because the thing that has struck both the president and his senior envoy on the Middle East, George Mitchell, is this concern in the Arab world about Iran. And so, therefore, they have started a process of trying to get the Arab states to take symbolic steps: overflight rights for Israeli aircraft, for civilian airliners, telephone connections, other things like that, to get the Arabs to do that. But the Arabs are saying, we're not going to do that unless Netanyahu does these other things. So sequencing is reality. It may not be a good thing. It may not be good tactics. It may not, in fact, help us out of this mess. But in the Arab mind, at least, in the mind of the Arab governments, they have to have something from Netanyahu before they can do anything for him. And that's the weakness of the current strategy. The president would like to get something moving on the symbolic front before he goes to Egypt on June 4th. I'm not sure he will.
What is the nature of the dynamic of the relationship, or the respect, the sense that the election of these two people new to office has some possibility of doing something?
I think Netanyahu was impressed with Obama on their first meeting, which was in March of 2007, when Obama was a very fledgling presidential candidate. And they met for an hour at National Airport in Washington. And Netanyahu has told friends that he came away from that meeting predicting that Obama would become president, although some of his aides told him, no, that's not possible. So he's impressed with Obama's intelligence. I think he sees Obama as someone who has a strategic mind. I think he's right in that, by the way. But I'm not sure that that's going to lead to a warm personal relationship. I don't think that the two men today felt particularly warm and cuddly toward each other. They were talking hard cases, and they were building positions for the future. Netanyahu clearly wants to stretch this out. We'll come back and we'll talk some more about settlements. I'm willing to talk about it. He's not willing to do it. And at some point, just as he has to with Iran, Obama has to make a decision about how far he goes with Netanyahu.
Okay, that's an interesting question to me. How far Obama might be prepared to go with Netanyahu?
I don't think the administration has yet decided how it's going to handle this. It's very clear to me, at least, that they are going to feel their way at least through the summer. They're going to meet the president of Egypt next week, I suppose. Mahmoud Abbas comes to town as well, and then the president goes to Egypt. And my guess is that sometime after that, they're going to try and figure out how they wrestle with this Israeli government, how they wrestle with the Palestinian internal situation. You know, you talked about elections. You have a divided Palestinian polity. You can't have a deal with one less than a half of the Palestinian people, which is Fatah, or nor with the other whatever fraction.
But don't you think that's a problem for Netanyahu?
Of course, it's a problem for the Palestinians first and foremost, but it's also a problem for American diplomacy.
But it's a problem when you say to the Israelis, "Well, you should make a deal with deal with who? You have two states.
The Israelis have
done talking about a three-state solution.
The Israelis have done a great deal to widen that gap between the two Palestinian factions.
That may be, but nevertheless,
I think one important question here, though, is whether Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian peace is a holy grail for President Obama, the way it was for Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton. Clearly, Carter and Clinton were building their presidential legacies on achieving that kind of deal. I don't sense that in President Obama.
I think he has a broader vision. I think he does want to do a deal with the Iranians, and I think he does want to do a comprehensive Arab-Israeli deal. Well, and I think he understands it can't just be the United States. He has to bring in other actors. The Turks, the UN, the Europeans, the Russians.
And he wants to say to the Muslim world, you know, there's a new attitude here.
I think he also believes in non-proliferation, and he worries about the eventuality that Lally talked about. And he wants to bring Israeli nukes onto the table. And bring them into some kind of non-proliferation regime in the Middle East. You cannot stop the Iranians and others, ultimately, from having nuclear weapons, as long as Pakistan and Israel have nuclear weapons.
And India?
Well, in the case of Iran, it's Pakistan and India that they worry about. And then in the case of Egypt, it's Israel and Iran they worry about. In other words, all of these countries worry about multiple vectors.
In Israel, there was a lot of talk when I was there a couple of months ago about a deal with Syria and trying to pry Syria out of the Iranian orbit. And I think now the Lebanese elections are coming up. And one of the problems with that deal now, I think, is that Hezbollah is so strong and probably is going to win the elections in Lebanon. But it's not clear anymore that Syria can dictate to Hezbollah what to do. And so it's not clear whether, I think that a lot of people thought that was a really, both here in the U.S. and in Israel, thought that was a really doable deal to pry Syria out of the arms of Iran.
I think they were living in illusions. They were living in a world of illusions if they thought they could pry Syria so easily away from Iran. Yeah, right. If Bret and I agree, then it's got to be true.
Well, put it this way.
I'm sure people believed that in Israel, but people in Washington also believed it, and I think it was wishful thinking.
On this consensus we have here. Jim Hoagland, thank you very much.
Charlie, thank you.
Lally, thank you.
Thank you,
Rashid,
Charlie.
thank you. Bret, thank you very much. Back in a moment. Stay with us.